Hello and welcome to this tutorial. Today we are going to build an application which is real-time weather app with Python Django and external APIs. At the end of this tutorial, you will be learned how to develop a web application with Python Django and how you can implement WebSockets to Python Django and how you can fetch the data from external APIs. Let me show you how the final application works. We can type a city name and hit the check weather button to fetch weather data of this city. When we hit the button, the request goes to Django app, and then Django takes the city and makes a request to the external API using the city and API key. Let's type another city and make request. Let's refresh this page and see how all stored city and weather data are coming from Django. To see how the application works, we can check this simple design on Xcoli draw. If client requests all records, Django directly returns the all stored records. If client requests by city, Django handles request and makes a new request to the external weather API. The external API returns the requested city weather data. Django checks if the city exists on database or not. If the city exists on database, Django updates it. If not, Django creates a new record of that city and weather data. As a summary, API, so Application Programming Interface, allows two programs to communicate. It facilitates integrations and interactions. We can develop our own APIs using Python Django or interact with external APIs using Django. In this tutorial, we will be using Django, WebSockets, plain JavaScript, and API provider as weatherapi.com. To see how WebSockets are working in this application, let's trigger the application with curl on the terminal. Here, you can see there is no refresh in the whole page. It just communicates via WebSocket and refreshes the data in the specific part of the app. We could develop a cron job or periodic task to fetch this city data from external API, but for this tutorial, triggering manually is fine. In the next session, we will be setting up our project and install the necessary packages. See you in the next session, and thanks for watching. In this session, we'll be setting up our project and install necessary packages. Let's get started by creating a new folder, name it as My Project, and open the folder with VS Code. I'll be using VS Code built on terminal and create a new Python virtual environment by using venv module. I'll give my virtual environment as env. You can give any name. And now our virtual environment instance is created. Let's activate it by typing source env/bin/activate. And it's activated. Now let's install the Django by typing pip install Django. It's successfully installed. Now let's create a project by typing django-admin start project and give a folder name I'll be using src and adding dot to initialize files in the current directory. As you see, our files are under the source src folder. Let's run the project by typing python manage/py run server, navigate to localhost, and our project is working successfully. In this session, we'll be creating templates, so HTML files and our first view. Previously, we did run our project successfully. In this session, we'll be creating our first app and our HTML files. Let's create a new folder and name it as templates. Django will look for HTML files in the templates directory. And now let's create our first application by typing python manage/py start app command and give a application name. I'll be using app as a name. So let's register this application to installed apps in the settings py and find out installed apps, and I'll be adding the app name here. Let's add some comments here to specify Django default apps and project apps and also external apps. The external apps will be added later. We can add comment notation as to do here, and let me close this pop-up. And now we will be adding a new path in the URLs file. Let's create a new path that will be handling root URL requests. I will leave this empty and will define app views index function will be called when the client make request to index path. Let's import app views from app, import views as app underscore views. And now we will be creating index function in the app views.py. Let's create index function, and this function will be accepting request as parameter and will be returning render. Render function takes two parameters. The first one is request, the second one is template name, which is index.html, which is under the app folder. And now we will be creating a templates folder. The Django will be looking for templates folder, and we will be creating a new folder as app and the index.html file under the app, and Django will be looking for templates under the templates. Let's specify this configuration in the templates section in the settings.py. We are making configuration for the Django that will be looking for templates under the templates folders. Let's create a new file as core.html. We will put every common elements in this core.html file, and we'll be adding our common JavaScript CSS files in the core.html files. Now I'm going to create a block which will be for header and also for body. We will override the body in the app index.html file, and I'm adding footer for demonstration here. And we can add some spaces and some comments here. Now I'm going to edit app index.html file, and I'll extend our core.html file by specifying In the first line, we are using extends keyword, and let's add some content here for the demonstration. This is header and this is footer. These fields are going to be common fields, and let's add some comment here. We can override this part in the other HTML files. And now let's copy the blog core body and paste into index.html. So we say here we are overriding this part. So for the demonstration, let's add a content. Welcome to the app index page, and save it. Now let's run the application with run server command, and let's go to our browser and refresh the page and see the result. This is header and this is footer sections are coming from core.html. In the previous session, we added templates, core HTML and index.html, and we designed our front-end site, and we extended core HTML in the index.html. In this session, I will add static file, which is style CSS, to our project to have better UI. As you see, my CSS file is under the static CSS folder. The CSS style is not important for this project, but to have better UI, we can use. Now I will be copying header part from here and paste it to core HTML file, and I'll be copying the body and paste to body side, body section, and I'll copy footer and paste to footer. There is no big difference, so you don't have to worry about it. Let's refresh the page, and we have got static error. We forgot to adding load static tag. We need to put top of the core HTML file load static, and let's refresh the page. As you see, there are differences, but our static style CSS couldn't be uploaded, so we need to make some configuration in the settings file to detect the static files. Let's open up the settings file and go to static part. Our static URL is static, so we need to add static files dirs. Let's look at on the Google Django documentation and find out static files dirs. Let's go to documentation, another link reference, and here we go. We have static files underscore dirs. We need to tell the Django our static files are under the static folder, and which is under the base dir. Let's save settings py, and remember that our CSS files are under the static folder. And now let's refresh the page and see everything is working perfectly and static files are loaded. Now we are gonna add input and button. Let's grab this code from here. This has input, button, and how to use div and paste into index.html in the body section, and save this, and let's refresh the page. Here we have input to allow users enter city name and check weather button to make request, and also how to use it, div. We have learned in this session how to load static files. In the previous session, we learned how to load static files and we redesigned our front-end side. In this session, we will be installing some packages to read environment variables from a file and also make requests to external APIs by using requests module. Let's try to install. Now pip not found because we didn't activate our environment. We can activate it by typing source env bin activate, and now let's try again installation. The packages are installed successfully. Now we can check our settings.py file. Now we are importing OS module and also load.env from .env package. We can read .env file and put our environment variables into it. We can read our API key from .env file by using os.getEnv function. We will be putting our API key here. Let's open our browser and navigate to weatherapi.com. You can create an account and access your API key in the account page. We'll be making requests to this URL by using our API key. We can access weather data. Also, we can pass city name and access weather data for a specific city. In this session, we'll be making requests to weatherapi.com. Let's copy this URL and navigate to terminal in the VS Code and initialize shell by typing python managepy shell command. I'm going to create a new variable as URL, and I'll be using fstring and paste copied URL to here. Let's edit the key part here and add settings.wa_API key here. While making requests, we are going to use city name, so I'm adding here city variable name temporarily. And we have settings is not defined error message. We should import settings from Django conf. And I'm gonna create a new variable city and assign to it Istanbul and build our URL again. And now I am going to import requests module and make HTTP GET request using requests.get by giving URL as the parameter. And let's see the result. It is 200, which is okay, means successful. Let's see the result as JSON. And here we see that our city name is Istanbul and we do have some condition data, and also I'm looking for temperature. To see the response better, we can import prettyprint as pp and we can pass our response to prettyprint function. Let's close these files and hit the enter. So we can see that our condition data, temperature as Celsius and Fahrenheit, and also location. So now I'm going to make a new request for another city, which is London. Let's rebuild our URL and let's call the get function again, assigned to response 2. Let's see the response JSON. Let's try to access condition data. We have got key error because condition is under the current. So we should access firstly current, then condition. We will be storing these response data in our Django application. In this session, we will be creating models to store API response data, such as condition text or icon, or temperature as Celsius. We will be creating weather model. Let me paste in my model here. As you can see, the model name is weather, which has city as char field, temperature char field, description text field, icon as char field, and we have updated date. We will be using a last updated epoch for this field, and we will also have API response as text field. This will be coming from response.text. And now let's make migrations for app. No change because we didn't save the file. Let's save it and try again. And model migration is generated, and now we did our migration. Now we can run our server. Actually, I'm going to create a new super user to see what our model look like in the admin panel. Let me create a user which has admin username and specify the password. And now let's register this model to admin panel by using admin.site.register, and let's import the model and save it. Let's run our server again and navigate to admin panel and log in as admin. As you see here, if we want to store our data, these fields will be used while storing the API response. We will be using API response data to store data. In this session, we will create a function that will export desired field values from the response. Let's create a function and name it request to weather API. This function will take city parameter, and like in the shell, we are building our URL with the settings API key and city. Let's call the request.get function, and here we specify raise for status for out of 200 status codes, and we convert to JSON and return to city, and this comes from location and name. Let's see our response data. This will be coming from location, and in the location we have a name. The value is London, and we have a description field that comes from current condition text, and we have icon, and we have temperature, and we have updated date that comes from last updated epoch, and we have API response will be assigning from response.text. And now let's see the response as formatted and check that again. We are accessing location name and description in the condition text and the icon, and we are exporting temperature from temperature_Celsius and last updated epoch, and also we store all API response as text, and we defined our function that will be called in some views. And now let's do imports. For the last updated epoch we imported daytime, and also we are importing settings from Django conf, and also import requests. This function will be used in views. In previous session we created a function that is request to weather API that accepts city. In this session we are going to make a request from frontend to our backend by hitting check weather button. The city name will be passed to backend side. And now let's create a view function, name it as trigger, and this will be accepting request as parameter, and this will be returning JSON response. We will be returning the same city name to the client, and the city can be accessed by typing request.get, and we are accepting city, and let's import the JSON response from django.http.response. And now let's save. We are gonna define a new path. This can be accessed using API/trigger/ and appViews.trigger function will be handling when the request comes to this path. And now let's save it and go to index.html. Previously we defined our input and button and gave the IDs for them. We can access these elements using their IDs. We define city input and access to this element with its ID, and also for button. For button, we add event listener to handle click operations, and here we access city input data that is entered by the user. We will pass this city as query params to the trigger function. Let's see the definition of trigger function. It accepts query params and builds URL search params using query params. Also there is query string that is built by search params to string, and query string is passed to this URL, and fetch function makes a request to the backend using this URL, especially path, and the backend response in this case is the data. We are using console log and console error to print out the data to our browser console. Let's refresh the application and enter a city name and click the button to make a request to the backend, and let's enter a new city name and check again. The data is coming from our backend side. In the next session, we will be using request to weather API in the trigger view function. In the previous video, we defined trigger function to accept request from the client by passing city name. In this video, we will be using this city name to pass to the external API, and we'll get back city weather data from API, and we will be processing the data and respond to the client. Let's give an example. This is Istanbul, and we are sending this Istanbul data to backend. We will be passing this city name to external API. Let's call the request to weather API function by passing city name, which is sent by the client, and we will be assigning this to weather underscore data variable. And now we are going to check if city exists in our database or not. We can use query set of the filter, and I'll be using iExact to ignore upper and lower cases. If the query set exists, so city exists in our database, we will be updating the existing record with the API response data, which is weather underscore data. Let's import the weather model from .models import weather. And now let's do the operation for if the city is not exist in our database. We are going to create a new record by using weather objects create function, and I'm going to return JSON response to send the weather data to the client, and also give a message like updated. And also for creation operation, I'll be responding to the client weather data. So let's save it and recap. If the city exists in our database, we will be updating by the API response. If it does not exist, we will be creating a new record. Let's test it in the browser, refresh the page and enter the city name. Here we can see that our API response, our Django application response, says that record is created. Let's check that in the administration panel by logging in, and you can see that Istanbul is created. Let's add another city, Sydney. Check the weather. The data is created again. And now I'm going to enter the Istanbul again, check the weather, and it says the data is updated. In this session, we learned how to pass the data from frontend to backend and make an external API call and store the API response in our Django application. In this session, we will be showing up the API response in the HTML part. So Let's edit the index HTML. We'll be putting API response here by creating HTML elements. We define weather container. We'll be accessing it. And now we have create elements function that has data and weather container arguments. Data is a list. A weather container will be an element to put everything inside it, and we loop over data with for each to put weather data into this weather container. We create an element that is div. We name it as cart container, and we are creating an icon using weather icon data to put its source attribute and temperature for the temperature text, and city for the city text, and description, and also updated date. We are appending child to material cart that we created in this function, and now we will be calling this function in the trigger function. We will be passing the data and also weather container, and then save it, and we will be testing now. Before testing, I have to say that our Django response data contains data and message, so I have to access our actual data here by using data keyword. And now let's test the application by entering city name and check the weather. We have an error because our data is coming as object, not a list, and because of that JavaScript is raising an error, so we need to fix this by adding weather data inside to list, and save and try again. And here we go. We do have a beautiful card to display our data like icon, city name, condition text, and also last updated information. In this session, we will be adding a new function to fetch all the records from our Django application. The client will be able to make a request for getting all the records of the city and weather information. Let's edit our index.html file. We'll be adding a new function, fetch data from API. This will be fetching all records from the Django backend, and we'll be using /API/data path. Like in the trigger function, we are creating elements by using responded data. Let's edit here like in the trigger function and save it. Now we are going to create a function in the views.py file. We will be creating query weather data function to pass city optional, and we will be preparing a query set to fetch all the weather objects, and if the city passed to this function, we will be making filtering, and if not, the query set will fetch all the weather records. So this is a kind of a serialization and fetching the objects and their related fields. We are fetching ID city, icon, temperature, description, and updated date information. Let's create API data view function and call the query weather data function. As you see here, we call all records. We didn't pass any city. When the client makes request, it will be getting all records from that view. Let's define a path. This will be API/data/ and we will be calling API data view function here and name it as API-data. Now let's save this one and refresh the application, and we forgot to calling the function in the index.html file. In the JavaScript part, we need to call the fetch data from API function initially, so we will be putting it at the end of this script. And let me add a comment here, call all records initially and put the function call here. Let's save it and refresh again, and we have got an error, but we also have a successful response from the backend. So there is a wrong usage in the fetch data from API because of this line, because we are returning back to the client data as query set, like serialized query set. We are not responding like in the trigger function in the Django. Notice that I removed accessing by the keyword name data, and let's refresh the application. Here we have all the records that are coming from Django, so database, to the client. In this session, we will be learning how to implement Websocket communication to our project. Let's see how the Websocket communication works as a diagram. Client makes a Websocket request to Django. In routing, there are Websocket URL patterns, which are handled by consumers. Consumers return the data to receivers, so it is client in our case. Now let's see the project file structure, and we'll be adding consumers and routing Python files to our project, and also do some editing in our ASCII.py file for WebSocket communication. Let's install Daphne package by giving pip install Daphne command. Daphne is a pure Python ASCII server for Unix. It behaves as the reference server for ASCII. And now Daphne is installed and some other packages with it. We will be adding Daphne to our settings. We need to add the Daphne in the top of the installed apps. And we need to add ASCII underscore application configuration to our settings for Daphne. Now we are gonna see routing py file in the app folder. We have WebSocket URL patterns here. We defined a path which is ws/data/, and we have consumers. The consumers will be handling WebSocket requests. The consumer is dashboard consumer, which inherits WebSocket consumer that comes from Django channels. Let's add some comment here. This WebSocket consumer comes from Django channels. Let's see the Django channels is installed or not. We can use pip freeze pipe grep channels, and it is not installed. Let's install that by typing pip install channels, and it's successfully installed. And we are going to explain dashboard consumer class now. Dashboard consumer class has some functions like connect function, which establish and accept connection. We also append this consumer object to active consumers when this function is called. When this connect function is called, we remove the object from active consumers. We can receive and send out data in our consumer. We can send data to the consumer from Django view and broadcast the data to the client. Now let's see what we have added to ASCII PY file. Let's explain this configuration a little bit. When a connection is made to the server, the protocol type router will inspect the type of connection. If it's a Websocket connection, the connection will be given to the auth middleware stack. And the auth middleware stack will populate the connection scope with a reference to the currently authenticated user similar to Django. Then the URL connection will be given to the URL router. In this case, URL router takes WebSocket patterns, WebSocket URL patterns. So basically our ASCII PY file configuration was like this, and now we are going to go JavaScript side. In here, we define a variable which is underscore socket. Then we define a function to establish WebSocket connection. We create a new WebSocket object which takes URL that starts with WS to make a WebSocket communication. Let's add a comment URL for WebSocket communication. And here we have endpoint which is ws/data. As you remember, we defined this path in the app routing WebSocket URL patterns. And we have socket on message function which handles backend response data. Notice that we pass received data to create elements function, so we will remove the create elements function called in trigger function. We will do that later. And we have socket on close function to handle communication close. Here we have set timeout to set up the connection in 2 seconds again. In socket on error function, we call socket close function and then set up connection again. And out of the function, we call connect WebSocket function initially. And now let's see what we changed in our app views. I'm going to edit trigger function for WebSocket communication. Remember that we were sending city from the client. I'm going to use if statement here. If city sent by the client, I'm going to make a call to external API, weather API. We were also doing check for city exists in our database or not. Let's remove these returning parts here and just remember that we were checking the city if exist, we were updating or not, we were creating. If the city sent by the client, we will also call query weather data function to do serialization. We'll getting query set and sending out to active consumers. The WebSocket part is here. We will be passing query set to consumer by passing the query set to receive function. Query set is the response data for sending to front end. You see that we are passing query set to receive function. Let me remind you that The WebSocket part is here. We are sending the query set to active consumers. Let's import the active consumers here. From .consumers import active consumers. Active consumers is list. We are appending the consumer object to active consumers when the connect function is called. As a summary, we fetch city weather data from weather API and do some checks and serialization and send processed data to the client throughout WebSocket. And we will return JSON response with triggered message. Let's save it and run the server by typing python manage py run server. Let's go to our browser and refresh the application. As you see that the data comes from Django directly. Let's remember our diagram. When the client asks all the records, they return directly. When the client checks with the client, it goes to external API, and you see that triggered, and actually the function call is successful, but representing the data is wrong, because in the index HTML, in the trigger function, we call create elements function with the data. So remember that we already called this function in the socket.onMessage function. So we should remove that, and let's save it and refresh the application again. Send the city and it works. The error has gone and we get triggered message, and we did WebSocket communication. Let's remember that we send city to Django and it passes the city to external API, and we get the API response and do some checks and serialization, and we send the data throughout WebSocket. The WebSocket works for the checked city functionality. I'm gonna show you one more thing, that we can actually call the trigger function in the terminal. So let's comment out here. We can call this path in terminal, or we can define some cron job periodic task to fetch city and weather data from the external API periodically. So let's show how this works in terminal. Let me clear the screen and use curl to make HTTP GET request, and I'll be putting my URL name localhost and also add API/trigger path, and also HTTP parameters. We defined city, and I'll be using the city name as Melbourne. Before hitting that, I'm going to open the browser, and at the same time I'm going to open the terminal. Let's make it smaller to see the effect, how it will be affecting the application. I hit it, and we have a wrong port number. I need to add 8000, because our application works in 8000 port number. I hit the enter and send the request. You see that there is no whole page reloading, There is only specific part of reloading, and we use Websocket for real-time communication here. Let's enter another city and it's loaded using Websocket. If I refresh the application, I do make HTTP request to our Django, and the all data are coming from our backend Django. In this session, we learned how to implement Websocket to our project. In this tutorial, we have learned how to build real-time weather dashboard application with Python Django. We learned how to build an application from scratch. We learned how to make a call to external API. And we have learned also how to implement Websocket to our application for real-time communication. For further work, you can create a cron job like using Celery. You can fetch the data periodically and implement to your application. I'm gonna be uploading the project to my GitHub account. So I renamed the project name as Real-Time Weather App. So you can access the files in my GitHub account, GitHub page. In this Git repository, I have some instructions to build the application, and you can access static files as well. Hopefully you have enjoyed and learned new techniques in this tutorial.